Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into the hushed corridors of medieval manors, not to admire their tapestries or noble feasts, but to uncover something far subtler and more unsettling. Behind every invitation lay a web of hidden rules and unspoken expectations that could make or break your reputation. So, before you settle in, take a second to like this video, and subscribe if you truly enjoy these explorations into the past. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is there. I love seeing how many corners of the world we gather from. Now, dim your lights, maybe wrap yourself in a blanket, and let's slip quietly into the shadowed etiquette of being a guest in a noble house. The unspoken expectation to praise every aspect of the manor. Imagine yourself arriving at the gates of a great English manor in the late 17th century. Perhaps you have traveled for hours along narrow roads, your carriage wheels grinding over uneven stones, before finally reaching the high ironwork arch that signals you have entered a world apart. A place where expectations hover invisibly, like a fine mist, pressing gently on everyone who crosses the threshold. Before you even step inside, your eye is drawn to the outer gardens. Long rows of hedges shaped into fantastical animals and mythological figures stretch across the landscape. There is a particular order to it all. The gravel paths carefully raked, the rose beds recently deadhead, the statues polished so they catch the sun. Here, a guest was expected to pause, to notice, and to remark in a voice measured and appreciative that the grounds were kept to a standard most families could never afford. It was an unspoken ritual of praise, a silent agreement between host and visitor. And it began long before you reached the Great Hall. Inside the entrance, the atmosphere shifted again. Your boots might have trodden on flagstones worn smooth by centuries of footfall. The air grew cooler and heavy with the mingled sense of beeswax polish and the faint mineral smell of old stone. Along the walls, enormous tapestries told stories that were meant to impress as much as to entertain. Hunts with dozens of hounds, great battles, the faces of ancestors posed in eternal triumph. Each thread had been chosen, each scene commissioned to convey not only wealth but the sophistication to deploy it tastefully. As you removed your gloves, you might have felt the eyes of the steward discreetly studying your expression, waiting for the smallest sign of admiration. It was understood that guests would comment on these tapestries. A few well-chosen words, how finely the colors were preserved, how lifelike the woven horses appeared, would confirm to your hosts that you grasped the significance of such possessions. To stand silent was not simply rude, it implied indifference or, worse, silent judgment. And in a society where reputation mattered more than nearly anything, even a hint of such disregard could echo far beyond the walls of the manor itself. Moving deeper into the house, you would likely be shown the main receiving room. Here, the arrangement of chairs and settees was deliberate. They were angled in such a way that conversation flowed easily, but so too did the opportunity to notice each object. The clocks imported from France, the cabinets of polished walnut, the thick carpets covering the floor. Every item was part of a silent demonstration, an invitation to acknowledge not merely wealth but discernment. The lady of the house might gesture casually to a new acquisition, offering you the chance to respond with measured admiration. A host who received no comment at all would feel the absence as keenly as a slight. The servants, too, were part of this tapestry of impressions. Their composure and quiet efficiency reflected upon the family's standing. When a footman carried in a tray without the slightest clink of porcelain, or when a maid arranged a vase so that every blossom faced precisely outward, it was all a performance of refinement. And in return, a guest was meant to notice these acts, subtle acknowledgments woven into polite conversation. If you failed to praise the orderliness, the perfect timing, the grace of the service, you risked being remembered as someone lacking the sensitivity to appreciate excellence. At dinner, the expectation to observe and compliment deepened further. Each course was presented in a way that invited gentle commentary. A sauce prepared to a recipe borrowed from a continental cook, or a pie crust so perfectly glazed it reflected the candlelight. The meal was more than sustenance. It was another quiet pageant of status. As you lifted your spoon, you would be aware that others were listening, even if they pretended otherwise, for the delicate phrasing of your observations. A host's satisfaction rested, in part, upon your ability to voice your approval without appearing insincere or effusive. This ritual was rarely discussed openly. Manuals of etiquette did not usually spell out the precise degree of praise expected for a well-kept household. But everyone knew it existed. It was part of the air itself, an unspoken choreography that ensured no one was left uncertain of their place. And while it may seem stifling to modern sensibilities, it was, in its own way, a means of maintaining harmony. By expressing admiration, guests affirmed the social order, confirming that all was as it should be. Beyond the visible surfaces, this habit of commentary had practical consequences. Reputation was the currency of the gentry. A household known for excellence in every small detail could attract advantageous alliances and secure invitations to the most exclusive gatherings. Stories of gracious hosts and impeccable surroundings spread easily along the country roads, reaching distant cousins and potential patrons. In this sense, your words of praise were not merely polite. They were a subtle investment in the family's continued prosperity. Imagine the hush that settled over the table when a new guest failed to play their part. A coolness would creep into the conversation. Eyes would flicker toward the host, waiting to see whether the omission would be addressed openly or left to smolder quietly. Most often it was the latter, but long after the guest had departed, the memory would linger, a small shadow on an otherwise polished reputation. As you finally prepared to take your leave, a servant might discreetly bring your coat, and you would retrace your steps through those same halls. Passing the tapestries again, perhaps you would offer a final remark: how the afternoon lights softened their colors, how the ancient stones seemed to hold the warmth of centuries past. This was not flattery for its own sake. It was the closing note of a carefully orchestrated exchange, an affirmation that you had understood the language of respect that governed every moment spent under the manor's roof. And so the cycle continued, each guest adding their quiet voice to a chorus of approval that upheld the house's standing in the world beyond its gates. A rhythm of expectation and response, so deeply woven into daily life that few ever questioned it at all. The obligation to arrive with gifts proportional to your station. Imagine yourself stepping down from a creaking carriage after a long, jostling journey along rutted roads. The manor rises before you, an intricate blend of timber beams and gray stone, its windows winking with candlelight behind heavy glass panes. The gravel crunches beneath your boots, and as you approach the doorway, there is a moment of quiet calculation. What have you brought to offer? In many corners of medieval and early modern Europe, the expectation to arrive bearing gifts was more than courtesy. It was a subtle, elaborate performance of social station. A visitor's offering was like an unspoken introduction. It declared your wealth, your refinement, and your respect for the household you entered. The practice itself rested on an intricate hierarchy. A prosperous wool merchant might carry a bolt of fine Flemish cloth, dyed a vivid blue with costly woad. A lesser yeoman might bring dried apples strung together with a length of twine, a humble token nonetheless acknowledging the obligation. Even the smallest gift was weighed against the giver's means. If your offering was too modest for your rank, or, conversely, ostentatiously excessive, it could spark a slow-spreading undercurrent of quiet disdain. The rhythm of these exchanges formed part of the etiquette that governed noble and gentry households. In the hall, a steward or seneschal would often receive the gift with an impassive nod, perhaps offering a murmured blessing or a polite phrase of gratitude. Later, your host might make some discreet comment about the quality of the cloth or the rarity of the preserved fruits you had selected. In this way, the transaction was acknowledged without overtly praising or disparaging it. Praise too effusive could embarrass, while silence could wound. Imagine the storeroom just beyond the kitchen, heavy oak shelves bowing under the weight of jars sealed with wax, cloth-wrapped bundles of spices, and carved boxes of candied citrus peel. Each item sat as a testament to someone's arrival, a material trace of old alliances and fragile goodwill. Gifts did not merely please the senses, they documented the flow of relationships. This custom was rooted partly in necessity. In an age when travel was slow and markets unreliable, the exchange of provisions and crafted goods was a way to ensure households remained supplied with luxuries that could not be produced locally. A noble family in a northern manor might prize a case of southern wine, or a rare glazed ceramic jug. At the same time, these objects reinforced the delicate balance of power, generosity expected, but never too freely given, gratitude offered, but never too effusive. It was not unusual for gifts to be carefully inventoried. In some households, scribes kept ledgers listing each offering in detail, the name of the giver, the weight or measure of the goods, their estimated value. Such records were not purely practical. They were a quiet ledger of loyalty and standing. Should you ever wish to petition your host for a favor, perhaps a recommendation, a loan, or the mediation of a dispute, these entries might be discreetly consulted to determine whether your past behavior deserved accommodation. Over time, the conventions of gifting grew more elaborate. In some regions, the wrappings themselves became part of the ritual. A piece of polished wood tied with a narrow ribbon could imply refinement. A sprig of evergreen tucked under twine spoke of seasonal goodwill. Even the manner of presentation, whether you bowed deeply or merely inclined your head, carried meaning, offering clues to your awareness of protocol. Imagine yourself standing in that threshold. Perhaps you have chosen a small chest of candied quince. The sweet, fragrant slices are arranged with care between layers of linen. As you lift the lid to display them, there is a moment when the household can see the extent of your thoughtfulness, the balance you have struck between modesty and respect. A murmur passes among the servants. You feel the subtle relief of having judged correctly, neither presuming too much nor appearing careless. Such rituals could also sharpen resentments. A guest who offered less than was expected risked the slow corrosion of reputation. Whispers might follow them from one manor to the next, that their purse had grown thin, or that they no longer respected the obligations of their station. Equally, a gift too lavish could seem manipulative, an attempt to buy favor or embarrass a host by obliging them to reciprocate beyond their comfort. This constant negotiation reveals much about the culture of status and display that shaped elite life. Hospitality was never merely about sharing bread and shelter. It was a performance, a delicate choreography in which each participant demonstrated awareness of their place in the world. Even in the humblest hall, the obligation to arrive with a suitable gift reminded everyone that rank was both privilege and burden. Beyond the manor houses, travelers often encountered similar expectations at religious establishments and urban guild halls. A pilgrim might bring a token offering, perhaps a small silver coin or a length of good wax for votive candles, to a monastery that would house them for a night. Merchants arriving to negotiate a contract with a guild were expected to present something of worth. A carved casket, a roll of fine parchment, a novelty from distant lands. In this way, the practice spread through every layer of society that aspired to gentility. Even families of moderate means learned to set aside a portion of their resources to maintain the rhythm of such exchanges. The steady flow of gifts became, in a sense, a secondary economy, one founded not solely on need, but on the deep human urge to acknowledge and be acknowledged. Over the centuries, customs evolved. Some gestures grew simpler as markets expanded and social mobility increased. But the old expectation never fully disappeared. You can still trace its echoes in modern traditions: hostess gifts wrapped in crisp paper, carefully chosen tokens presented at celebrations, the quiet anxiety over whether an offering is appropriate. As you imagine yourself stepping back out onto the gravel path, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke, you carry with you the knowledge that the exchange has been observed, noted, and absorbed into the unspoken calculations of the household. A token of respect, a measure of station, and a small reassurance that you have, for now, met the unspoken obligations of your time. The custom of observing strict seating arrangements at meals. Imagine yourself stepping across the worn threshold of a medieval hall, your shoes brushing over straw scattered across cold flagstones to soften the echo of countless footsteps. The air is heavy with the mingled scents of roasted meats, beeswax candles, and the damp breath of stone walls that have absorbed centuries of voices. Before you stretches a long wooden table, polished by the resting of elbows and the scrape of trenchers. At first glance, it is simply a place to eat. But in truth, it is an unspoken map of power, respect, and subtle rivalry. In such halls, seating arrangements were not a matter of convenience or whim. They were a deliberate reflection of the social order, carefully constructed and vigilantly maintained. Where you sat told everyone who you were, how close you were to favor, how far you were from disgrace. Guests often learned quickly that even a moment's hesitation or an ill-chosen seat could reveal ignorance or presumption. At the head of the table, often slightly elevated on a dais, sat the lord or lady of the manor. Their chair might be larger than the others, adorned with carved symbols or draped in a tapestry that spoke of lineage and authority. From this vantage point, they could look out across the company and observe each gesture, each conversation, each sign of loyalty or dissent. To be seated nearby was not simply a matter of convenience. It was a quiet declaration that you were valued, that your counsel or companionship was prized above the rest. The further one moved down the table, or to the benches arranged along the walls, the less prestigious the position became. Those seated near the salt, placed in a heavy cellar at the lord's right hand, enjoyed a certain distinction. To be above the salt was a phrase that would echo through the centuries, denoting rank and closeness to power. Those below the salt accepted their lesser status without complaint, at least in public. Imagine the tension that might accompany an invitation to dine. A guest new to the household would watch for subtle cues, where the steward gestured, where a senior retainer guided them. The wrong seat, claimed too quickly, could brand them as overstepping. Conversely, an honored guest who insisted on sitting too far away risked appearing false in their modesty or ungrateful for the host's regard. These customs were more than empty ritual. They offered a way to keep order in an era when personal relationships governed everything from marriage alliances to military service. Seating arrangements created a visible framework that reinforced each person's place within the complex web of obligation. In some households, a steward or master of ceremonies was responsible for arranging place cards or issuing whispered instructions. In others, the system was so entrenched that no formal guidance was needed, everyone simply knew. Over time, small changes in a guest's seat could reflect shifts in fortune or favor. A man who had once sat near the dais might find himself moved a few places down after a dispute or a costly mistake. Such demotions were rarely announced, but everyone noticed. The rhythm of their lives was punctuated by these silent judgments, as visible as the silver platters and goblets set out for the meal. For those of lesser rank, hired laborers, itinerant musicians, humble craftsmen, places were reserved at side tables or in the outer reaches of the hall. These individuals still shared in the meal but did so under no illusion of equality. The dishes served to them might be simpler, the bread coarser, the ale thinner. Yet even among these ranks, there were gradients. The senior cook might outrank a visiting messenger, a trusted huntsman might expect a seat closer to the hearth. Seating also shaped how people experienced the meal itself. Proximity to the host often meant better access to the finest dishes, more generous portions, and the chance to overhear or contribute to important conversations. Those further away might catch only murmurs, punctuated by the clatter of trenchers and the occasional burst of laughter drifting from the high table. In some households, tapestries were hung behind the lord's seat to create a kind of stage. The honored guests became players in a tableau of rank and ceremony. Servants would weave through the crowded benches, carrying steaming platters and pitchers, while their eyes discreetly tracked the faces of those they served. A word spoken too freely, a glance held too long, a cup left empty too often, all were noted and later recounted in the quiet spaces below stairs. Consider how this meticulous choreography influenced even the simplest gestures. A guest rising from the table did so with care, ensuring they did not disturb those of higher rank. When it came time to offer a toast, the order in which cups were raised reflected not only respect but allegiance. Even in moments of celebration, the pattern of seating was a reminder that every joy was bound to duty. The practice of strict seating arrangements gradually softened over time. As notions of status shifted and households grew less rigid, the symbolism of place at table began to fade. Yet echoes of this custom remain. In formal banquets, in state dinners, in the quiet insistence that the guest of honor should sit at the host's right hand, we can still glimpse the old patterns. They are reminders of an era when a meal was never only about food, but a ritual of recognition and hierarchy. As you imagine yourself seated at that long table, perhaps near the warmth of the fire or further away in the cool shadows, consider what it might have felt like to know precisely what your place meant. To glance across the boards and understand, without a word spoken, the shape of the world and your standing within it. In this way, the medieval table was both a comfort and a challenge. It offered belonging, a promise that each person had a role to play. But it also held up an unflinching mirror to ambition, disappointment, and the quiet hope that, one day, a seat closer to the dais might be yours. The quiet scrutiny of how guests treated household servants. Imagine yourself arriving at a grand manor, the kind with thick stone walls that held in the night's chill and tapestries that softened the echo of every footstep. The air smells faintly of beeswax and the smoke from the kitchen hearth, winding invisibly through the corridors. You are not the only one under observation. The moment you cross the threshold, a subtle assessment begins, one you might not even notice at first. It is not only the host who watches you, or the fellow guests glancing to see if your shoes are polished. It is also the quiet scrutiny of how you address the household servants. In noble households of the medieval and early modern periods, the treatment of servants was more than a question of simple courtesy. It was an unspoken test of refinement and character. A guest who spoke to a footman with patient civility demonstrated self-command, a sign that they belonged among the polite. A visitor who snapped orders or offered no acknowledgement at all betrayed a certain pride, the kind that could stain reputations in the softest of ways. Servants were, in many senses, the silent witnesses to everything. They carried in platters heaped with roasted meats, poured the spiced wine into goblets, and took away each dish in its turn. They warmed beds with heated stones slipped beneath the covers. They fetched water in the morning, often before the dawn bell had sounded. And though they moved with practiced deference, their presence was constant, like the rhythm of a clock no one quite hears until it stops. For noble hosts, these quiet observations were more than idle curiosity. They formed part of the calculus by which alliances were measured. A suitor who treated a chambermaid as invisible might one day lack gentleness in marriage. A visiting dignitary who thanked the cook personally for a fine meal demonstrated not only generosity but the understanding that loyalty was earned in small gestures. In a world where status was a fragile edifice, every word spoken below stairs could be repeated above them. Consider the rituals of serving at table. A gentleman's manner when receiving a dish revealed his breeding as clearly as his clothes. Did he look a servant in the eye? Did he murmur thanks, or simply seize what was offered? A lady's request for more bread could be soft as a whisper or sharp as a reprimand, and the difference carried weight. Even the way a guest responded to an accidental spill, common in an age of heavy trenchers and uneven floors, could ripple outward. A mild smile and a forgiving word might cement goodwill. A scornful glare could become fodder for gossip that lasted the season. This constant scrutiny did not make every moment tense. Rather, it created a sort of silent choreography. The servant knew the steps by heart, when to approach, when to withdraw, how to make their presence almost invisible. The guest, if wise, learned to follow the rhythm, to thank the boy who brought fresh candles, to greet the housekeeper with a respectful nod. In these exchanges, both parties performed the delicate work of preserving dignity, one's own and the others. Beyond the hall, in private chambers, the same quiet test continued. Servants were often tasked with tending the fire or laying out garments. Here, in the hush before sleep, a guest's true nature sometimes slipped through. There are records of noble families quietly observing which guests spoke kindly to the maid who brought hot water, and which treated her like part of the furniture. These impressions could influence decisions about marriages, business arrangements, or even alliances in times of conflict. The historian's archive holds examples of letters that remark not only on a guest's wit or charm but on how they spoke to servants. One lord wrote to his cousin, praising a visitor who showed a gentle regard to the lowest boy, which speaks well of the temper. Another described a guest whose every command was laced with impatience, concluding simply, "He is no friend to the humble." Such notes, tucked among inventories and legal documents, remind us how deeply these small encounters mattered. The servants themselves were not oblivious. They too formed opinions. A courteous word might earn a guest a little extra care. Fresh linens, a warmer fire, perhaps a discreet warning about a loose step on the stair. Disdain, on the other hand, could lead to small omissions. A cup not quite full, a garment left to chill. Though bound by duty, servants were human, with their own quiet pride. In this way, the manor became a living organism of interwoven attentions. The great hall, with its carved beams and long trestle tables, was not only a place of ceremony but a stage where character revealed itself in fleeting moments. The kitchen below, fragrant with herbs and the hiss of boiling water, was no less important in this hidden theater. If you imagine yourself as a guest in such a house, you might feel the hush of expectation pressing softly around you. You might notice how the servant's eyes flick to your face when you speak. You might become aware that every please, every thank you, every pause to acknowledge their efforts was part of an unwritten code, one that marked your place in the ledger of esteem. And so, in an age when alliances could rise and fall on perceptions, the simplest exchanges carried the greatest significance. Courtesy was never merely ornament. It was a quiet declaration of who you were. To the noble host, watching from the high table, these details whispered truths more reliably than any formal introduction. Even now, centuries later, the idea lingers: how the smallest acts, performed without flourish, reveal the depth of one's character. It is a reminder that, though the grand feasts and elaborate ceremonies have faded into history, the gentle art of respect remains as enduring as the stones that once formed those manor walls. The expectation to participate in prayers at specific hours. Imagine yourself waking before dawn, your breath visible in the cool, hushed darkness of a medieval manor. The household is not yet stirring in the corridors, but already, in the small chapel attached to the great hall, a low glow is growing behind the stained glass windows. This is the hour known as matins, the first of several daily prayers that structured not only monastic life but, increasingly, the routines of noble households. Even those unaccustomed to ritual, merchants visiting on business, distant cousins seeking favor, or foreign envoys wary of unfamiliar customs, were expected to present themselves at dawn and again at dusk. It was not so much a test of piety as a demonstration of respect for the host's way of life. Skipping the chapel might be tolerated once, if the visitor pleaded exhaustion or illness. But a second absence was harder to explain, and a third marked the guest as indifferent, even contemptuous. The rhythm of their lives was shaped by these hours of devotion. The day was not simply divided by meals or work but by moments when the entire household gathered to acknowledge the unseen order that guided their fortunes. In the earliest light, before the chores of the kitchen and the demands of the Lord's affairs began, the chapel became a small universe unto itself. There, candles guttered in tall iron holders, and the air was thick with the faint sweetness of beeswax. The cold stone floor pressed through the soles of woolen slippers as the household processed in, each person finding their appointed place. For some, these rituals offered a comforting predictability. A kitchen maid might whisper her private worries into the stillness, her voice merging silently with the Latin chants she scarcely understood. A steward, more educated, might follow each phrase, reciting along with the priest, his mind already sorting the day's accounts. And the Lord himself, standing nearest the altar, performed his devotions with solemn attention, aware that every eye, servant and guest alike, measured his demeanor. Yet for others, especially those newly arrived or drawn from lands with different traditions, the hours of prayer could feel like a quiet trial. Imagine a merchant from a distant town, unaccustomed to these expectations, finding himself gently but insistently escorted to the chapel before the first light crept over the fields. The pressure to conform was subtle but ever-present. No one shouted. No punishments were announced. But any absence was noticed. A quiet murmur might rise as the congregation dispersed. He did not attend. And that remark, almost casual, could settle like a shadow over future negotiations. Throughout the day, other hours, terce, sext, and none, were marked by monastic communities but less rigorously observed in lay households. Still, the great gatherings at dawn and dusk retained their significance. The evening prayer, vespers, often carried a deeper sense of reflection. After a day's labors, The chapel glowed warmer in the light of more candles, and the darkness beyond the windows seemed to press closer, reminding all present of the frailty of human life and the comfort of shared ritual. Some guests, wary of causing offense, prepared carefully. They learned the correct posture, standing or kneeling as the priest intoned each blessing. They practiced murmuring the Pater Noster, hoping to blend their voices with those of the household. Others watched for cues, rising when the steward rose, bowing when the lady of the house inclined her head. Even those who believed little in the efficacy of prayer recognized the social necessity of appearing devout. To skip the appointed hours was to risk more than disapproval. It hinted at an unwillingness to belong. Imagine the slow procession into the chapel at dusk. A line of figures moving by candlelight, their shadows wavering across carved walls. The scent of rosemary and old wood mingling with the faint tang of tallow smoke. The priest's voice, low and steady, offering blessings that drifted through the cold air like a benediction. In this shared silence, each person felt the subtle weight of expectation. Participation was not optional. It was the thread that stitched the household together, an unspoken agreement that all who crossed the threshold would abide by its customs. Occasionally, a guest would misjudge the importance of these gatherings. Perhaps he overslept, or chose instead to remain by the warmth of the kitchen hearth, convinced that no one would remark on his absence. Yet by the following day he would sense the change. A polite distance at the table. A measured courtesy that fell just short of welcome. The slight, though never voiced outright, lingered long after departure. In letters exchanged months later, the host might still recall, "He did not honor our hours of prayer." This expectation of attendance was rooted in a larger conviction that order, spiritual and social, was best preserved through ritual. In an age where fortune could shift with the harvest or the favor of a king, stability mattered more than private belief. To stand shoulder to shoulder in the chapel was to confirm one's place in that delicate balance. And so, as dawn returned, the pattern began again. Candles lit, the priest intoned his verses, and the congregation gathered, servants, nobles, and guests alike, bound together by the quiet insistence that all should be seen, if only for a moment, in common purpose. When you imagine yourself in that dim chapel, you might feel the gentle press of centuries of habit. The sense that every step, every murmur of prayer, was part of an unbroken chain stretching back to ancestors who had also risen in the dark. And as the final blessing faded into the stone walls, you would know that the true measure of respect was not in fine gifts or elaborate words, but in simply being present, eyes lowered, among the others. And in this way, the expectation to join in prayer, to accept the rhythm of their days, became one of the quietest yet most enduring customs of life in the manor, a simple act of belonging that was neither forced nor entirely voluntary. Just an understanding, clear as the morning bell, that some silences spoke louder than any proclamation. The custom of sending notes of gratitude before leaving the estate. Imagine yourself rising early in a guest chamber of a great country estate. The hour is quiet, just before the household begins to stir, and you find yourself in that peculiar interval between belonging and departure. Your trunks have been packed by the maid, the last of your belongings gathered into neat bundles. Even so, one important task remains, the writing of a note, or sometimes several, expressing your gratitude in carefully chosen words. This was not a matter of personal whim but an established custom, as much a part of the rhythm of noble hospitality as the evening meal or the morning walk through the gardens. The note of thanks was both private gesture and public record, the final thread woven into the tapestry of a guest's visit. Picture yourself seated at a small walnut writing desk, a thin wedge of sunlight creeping across the surface. A servant has brought ink in a glass well, the nibs of quill pens laid out with a precision that seems to make even the act of writing feel ceremonial. The paper is thick, sometimes embossed with the family crest of your hosts, which in itself serves as a quiet reminder of their position and the obligations of respect it entails. The tone of these notes varied with the nature of the visit. If you were a distant cousin who had stayed only a day or two, you might write simply of the pleasure of conversation and the comfort of the rooms prepared for you. But if you were a political ally or someone whose opinion carried weight in social circles, the language would often be richer. sometimes almost florid in its expressions of gratitude. It was understood that one must remark on particular kindnesses. A hostess's careful attention to dietary preferences, perhaps, or the thoughtful arrangement of musical entertainment after supper. These details, once captured in ink, would not fade quickly. The letters were gathered into ledgers and collections, stored in cabinets alongside more official papers, leases, contracts, legal agreements. In an age when reputation could determine one's fortunes, these handwritten notes were quiet instruments of influence. Consider the perspective of the host. Long after your carriage had rumbled away down the drive, they would sit with your letter unfolded on their writing table. It was not unusual for such notes to be read aloud to other family members or to guests who arrived later. The approval of a respected visitor might be cited in conversation weeks or months afterward, an unspoken credential proving that the estate was run with a degree of generosity and refinement worthy of admiration. Over time, the accumulation of these letters could form an unofficial archive of favor. In disputes over inheritance or precedence, in arguments about the social standing of a family, it was not unheard of for an old letter of thanks to be produced as evidence that influential persons had recognized the household's hospitality. A single sentence, praising the warmth of the welcome or the elegance of the table, could carry surprising weight if repeated in the right company. Even the handwriting itself mattered. The legibility of the script, the balance of the lines across the page, these were subtle indicators of a person's refinement and care. A scrawled, hasty note might suggest impatience or disdain. By contrast, a neatly composed letter, folded and sealed with care, demonstrated respect for the unspoken codes that governed relations among the landed classes. Imagine the hush of the morning as you dip your quill and begin your own letter. Perhaps you recall the hush of the dining hall, the flicker of candlelight on polished silver, the muted footsteps of servants arranging the courses with precision. You find words to praise the generosity extended to you, the ease of your rest in the well-appointed chamber, the civility of the conversations by the fire. Some guests, particularly those who wish to cultivate alliances, would add a note of anticipation, suggesting that they looked forward to another visit or hoped to host their benefactors in turn. Such hints were not always sincere, but they served a purpose. They left open a path of reciprocity, a sense that favors might be exchanged again at some future date. And so your note was more than a courtesy. It was a tiny pledge, a quiet assurance that you recognized the invisible bonds tying host and guest. It confirmed that you understood your place within a delicate lattice of obligation, gratitude, and expectation. When at last you blotted the ink and folded the paper into a crisp rectangle, you might hand it to the steward yourself or leave it on the writing desk to be collected later. The moment had a certain finality, an act that closed your stay as surely as the sound of the carriage door latching behind you. From the host's perspective, the receipt of the letter was no small event. There was often an unspoken ritual in reading it, sometimes at breakfast, sometimes in the quiet of the afternoon study. A particularly gracious note might be preserved with a ribbon, marked with the date of its arrival. Over time, these bundles accumulated, tucked into boxes lined with linen or bound into volumes that served as both personal mementos and proofs of standing. One can imagine a family, decades later, untying a bundle of old letters. The script might have faded, the edges of the paper grown fragile. Yet the sentiments endured, a chain of acknowledgments stretching across generations. In an era when so much depended upon perception, these letters became a form of currency that never fully lost its value. Even today, in country houses that remain inhabited, you may find drawers containing such relics, yellowed paper embossed with crests, phrases of praise carefully turned. They are small reminders of how deeply the expectation of gratitude shaped social life, how every visit, no matter how brief, carried with it the obligation to confirm, in writing, that one had witnessed and appreciated the host's efforts. And so, the custom continued year after year. A quiet exchange of ink and paper that secured alliances, soothed rivalries, and reinforced the delicate hierarchies upon which the entire world of the gentry depended. A simple note of thanks, written before departing the estate, was never simply a polite gesture. It was an acknowledgement of belonging to a culture where reputation was a living thing, nourished by every small courtesy and recorded for those who came after to see. The ritual of accepting even unwanted hospitality with grace. Imagine yourself seated on a long, narrow bench in a hall that smells faintly of wood smoke and simmering broth. The fire flickers behind an iron grate, casting slow-moving shadows across the rush-strewn floor. A servant passes behind you, carrying a platter arranged with careful precision, small, dark loaves of bread, a wedge of cheese spotted with blue veins, and a dish of pickled fish glistening under a layer of oil. You have traveled far to reach this place, and the host who welcomed you did so with the easy formality of someone long accustomed to receiving visitors. Yet, beneath the warmth of their greeting lies an unspoken expectation that you will accept whatever is placed before you without complaint or hesitation. Throughout much of medieval and early modern Europe, hospitality was both a duty and a display. A household's generosity was proof of its stability and reputation, but it was also a subtle test of the guest's manners. To refuse any part of a meal, no matter how unpalatable, was to risk appearing ungrateful or worse, to imply that the household's provision was lacking. This ritual of gracious acceptance often began before the first mouthful was even taken. When the servant offered the platter, you were expected to lean forward, to nod or incline your head, and to lift the food with deliberate care. These small gestures confirmed that you understood the privilege of being fed in another's hall. Imagine the array of dishes that might confront an unprepared visitor. Dense, tangy cheese wrapped in leaves to preserve it during the long months of winter. Ale with a sour, yeasty edge. Pottages thickened with unfamiliar grains, or stews seasoned with herbs that filled your mouth with bitterness. It was not uncommon for a guest to be served parts of an animal rarely eaten today: tongue, tripe, or small, dark sausages made from scraps and offal. Yet the expectation remained: you would taste each offering, however strange. To push a dish aside or to let your cup remain full was to risk causing quiet offense. The host, observing from across the board, would note your reactions. A carefully neutral expression, a small smile, a courteous nod, became a necessary part of the meal. There were practical reasons for this custom. In a world where travel could be dangerous and unpredictable, hospitality was more than courtesy. It was a fragile assurance of safety and goodwill. Sharing food was a symbolic gesture of trust. To refuse it was to declare yourself outside the bonds of mutual obligation that kept communities functioning. At times, these rituals pressed the boundaries of comfort. Imagine yourself lifting a piece of preserved fish, the skin slightly leathery, the taste sharp with vinegar. Perhaps you feel your appetite falter, but you raise it to your lips all the same. The rhythm of the meal depends on this quiet cooperation, this willingness to surrender personal preference for the sake of communal respect. Even the manner of drinking carried significance. A cup was offered with two hands, and you were expected to hold it firmly, to take a sip whether you were thirsty or not. In some households, a guest was served a draught of spiced wine or warmed ale almost as soon as they entered the hall. Accepting it, however strong or unfamiliar the flavor, was the first step in showing deference to your host. Among the elite, these expectations were especially pronounced. Nobles prided themselves on offering rare delicacies, dishes that demonstrated their wealth and access to distant markets. A glazed pie filled with exotic spices. A sugared confection shaped into a crest or an emblem. Even when a guest found such richness overwhelming, it was better to taste and praise than to decline. In smaller households, the same principle applied in simpler form. A pot of humble pottage could be as meaningful as a feast. The poor were known to share what little they had, and a traveler might be given a crust of bread and a mug of thin ale. Even then, it was essential to receive these gifts with the same grace you would extend to a grand banquet. Over time, the ritual of accepting all hospitality became deeply woven into social expectations. To fail at it could brand you as proud or ungrateful, qualities that could follow you far beyond a single evening. In some chronicles, entire disputes were said to begin when a guest neglected to taste a dish or left a cup untouched. Imagine the end of the meal. You set your knife down carefully along the edge of your trencher. The last crumbs of bread rest beside a smear of honey or a curl of cheese rind. A servant moves quietly to clear the remains, and you feel a subtle relief that the test of courtesy is complete. Yet even as you rise, there remains a final step. A few words of thanks, spoken plainly but with sincerity. In some regions, it was customary to praise the quality of the meal, no matter what you truly felt. "You have fed me well," you might say, even if the broth had been thin and the bread coarse. The words were less about the meal itself than about honoring the bond of hospitality. Over the centuries, the precise dishes changed, but the principle endured. In 18th century households, guests were still expected to accept each course, even as the food grew more elaborate. Trifles layered with custard and jam, small roasted game birds with sweet sauces. The ritual of polite acceptance remained the same. Today, echoes of this custom survive. You can see it when a guest tastes a dish they do not care for but smiles and says it is interesting. When someone accepts a glass poured for them, even if they prefer not to drink. These small gestures are remnants of an older world, one in which survival and safety often depended on the delicate art of appearing content. Imagine yourself stepping away from the long table, the smells of smoke and herbs clinging to your clothing. Outside, the evening has deepened into a blue dusk. You have eaten more than you wished, perhaps tasted things you did not enjoy. Yet you carry with you the knowledge that you have honored the ritual, that you have preserved the fragile balance of respect and gratitude. In this quiet way, you have taken part in a centuries-old tradition, accepting every offering with grace, and leaving behind the unspoken assurance that you understood the gift for what it truly was, a sign that you were welcome and, for a time, at peace. The subtle rules about how long a visit could last. Imagine yourself stepping down from a horse or carriage onto the gravel sweep before a grand country house. The air is cool, fragrant with clipped box hedges and the faint sweetness of wood smoke drifting from the chimneys. A servant bows, takes your traveling cloak, and leads you across the threshold into a world where every gesture has a hidden significance. You have come to pay a visit, an act that, on the surface, appears simple. But in truth, it is governed by a latticework of expectations so fine and intricate that even seasoned guests could never entirely relax. Among the most delicate of these expectations was understanding precisely how long to stay. Visits were an essential part of social life, a way to reinforce bonds of loyalty, affection, or obligation. But the duration of your stay spoke volumes before you ever opened your mouth. Depart too soon, and you risked implying that your host's company bored or dismayed you. Remain too long, and you might seem to take advantage of generosity or imagine yourself more welcome than you truly were. Unlike today's appointments and calendars, these matters were rarely written down. Instead, you were expected to sense, almost intuitively, when your presence had been just enough, and no more. This unspoken rule hovered in every corridor and chamber, a constant undercurrent to conversation and ceremony. Consider the rhythm of a typical visit. After your arrival, you would be shown to a chamber to rest and refresh yourself. Perhaps you would change into garments more suited to the formality of the hall. You might be offered a light repast, small pastries, spiced wine, slices of preserved fruit, to revive you after travel. In those early hours, you were an honored guest, your host eager to display courtesy and hospitality. Yet even in this warmth, time was ticking quietly forward. If you had come merely to deliver respects, you would likely depart within the day, before sunset colored the sky. Such brief calls were common among neighbors or allies wishing to affirm goodwill without imposing. A short visit, graciously accepted, could strengthen a bond more surely than an ill-considered stay. Longer visits, perhaps several days, were reserved for those with close ties or pressing business. Here, the rhythm of life shifted to include you. Your seat at meals remained constant, your presence anticipated in the chapel or the gardens. Still, no matter how warmly you were received, you were expected to remain alert to subtle signs that it was time to prepare your departure. A host might not say outright that the visit should end. Instead, there would be delicate clues. Invitations to join a hunt or an outing might cease. Fewer messages would arrive at your chamber. The household rhythm would begin to draw back around its own routines, gently encouraging you to slip away without discord. Imagine the unease of misjudging the moment. If you departed too early, you risked offending your host, who might wonder whether their welcome had seemed insincere. Rumors could ripple through the county, suggesting you had detected some failing, poor housekeeping, inhospitable manners, or a breach of etiquette. Conversely, to linger past the point of ease was to test a host's patience and resources. Provisions had to be stretched, chambers kept in readiness, servants assigned to your comfort. Overstaying might not provoke open criticism, but it would be remembered and, in some cases, quietly remarked upon in letters or diaries. In larger households, where guests came and went in a near-constant stream, the situation grew even more complex. One family's departure often made space for the arrival of another. Staying past your unspoken turn could inconvenience not just your host but also the wider web of visitors whose comings and goings formed the subtle calendar of aristocratic life. These expectations extended beyond the noble classes. Even among prosperous yeomen or respected merchants, there was an art to choosing the right length of visit. A tradesman might call on a valued patron to present a gift or discuss terms, always aware that to sit too long over ale and conversation could blur the line between professional respect and unwanted familiarity. In smaller communities, where families depended on one another for harvest help or protection, visits carried layers of meaning. Staying the night might signal alliance, trust, or shared purpose. Staying for several nights without clear cause, however, could rouse quiet suspicion. Was your presence merely social? Or was there some hidden grievance or claim you were preparing to assert? The delicate balance of a visit was also shaped by seasons and festivals. During harvest, a guest might be encouraged to remain longer, their hands welcome in the fields. At Christmastide, households expanded to absorb kin and neighbors, tables crowded with pies and ale. In such times, the rules softened somewhat, and a longer stay could be taken as a compliment to the host's generosity. Yet even then, most visitors understood that once 12th night had passed, the expectation was to return home before normal rhythms resumed. If you imagine yourself preparing to depart, you might see the ritual unfold with quiet precision. A servant would bring your traveling coat and boots. The host would offer parting words, always gracious, whether or not your timing had pleased them. You would bow or curtsy, stepping out into the morning air with a sense of relief and perhaps the faintest anxiety. Had you judged the moment correctly? Would your departure be discussed after the door closed behind you? Long after the visit ended, its memory might linger in household accounts or correspondence. A note might record that you departed with suitable courtesy. A ledger might show the small gifts exchanged to seal goodwill. And in the minds of those who had watched your visit unfold, an impression, favorable or otherwise, would quietly take root. In this way, the act of visiting became one more thread in the complex tapestry of social life. It demanded not only good manners and generosity but also sensitivity, restraint, and the willingness to read signs others preferred not to make explicit. So the next time you imagine a medieval hall, its rafters dark with age, its hearth glowing with coals, picture not only the splendor of the feast or the echo of laughter but the constant, watchful measuring of time. Every guest carried within them the quiet knowledge that departure was as important as arrival. To leave at precisely the right moment was the final gift you offered your host, a gesture of respect, understanding, and the enduring hope that the door would be open to you again. The practice of offering small tokens when departing as a sign of respect. Imagine yourself as a guest in an old English manor. The days of your visit have passed in a slow, ceremonial rhythm. Formal meals beneath the gaze of ancestral portraits, quiet hours in the garden where the hedges stood clipped into severe geometries, evenings by the hearth with wine warming in your hand. And now, the time has come to depart. You might think that your obligations have ended, that all that remains is to thank your host, gather your belongings, and step back into the world beyond the gate. But in truth, there is one more small ritual to perform, one last gesture by which your character would be measured. Before you left, it was quietly expected that you would offer a token of thanks to the household servants. This was not a grand gift or some ostentatious display. Instead, it took the form of coins pressed into a waiting palm, or a small item tucked into a handkerchief, a gesture both modest and deeply significant. The tradition had deep roots. In medieval and early modern Europe, a household was a complex ecosystem. Servants were not simply employees. They were witnesses to every nuance of a guest's behavior, the impatience or gratitude, the temper or restraint. And when departure day arrived, they were the ones who prepared the traveling cloak, fetched the horse or carriage, and carried the trunks out to the courtyard. Offering a token was a recognition of this labor, an acknowledgement of countless small kindnesses. Imagine the scene. The guests standing near the door, the air thick with the scent of damp wool and the faint traces of last night's fire. A footman waits to see if you will remember. Perhaps you feel in your pocket for a few silver pennies, or you draw out a slender parcel, a length of ribbon or a small parcel of sweetmeats. This moment is performed without flourish. To speak of it openly would be considered impolite. Yet everyone understands its importance. Such tokens were more than mere gratuities. They helped maintain the fragile web of goodwill that stretched between visitor and household. A coin placed in the hand of the scullery maid could mean an extra measure of warmth in the smile she gave you. A small gift to the stable boy might ensure that your horse was brushed and fed with special care before your journey. And a failure to offer anything at all was seldom forgotten. There are accounts in household records, written in the tight, looping script of stewards, of guests whose names were marked by their reluctance to give. A notation might read simply, "Departed with no remembrance," the phrase conveying a quiet censure. In an age when reputation was a form of currency, such comments could travel farther than you might expect, shared discreetly between households in letters and conversations by the fire. This practice also reflected the broader expectations of hierarchy and reciprocity that governed social life. Just as a guest was expected to praise the host's hospitality, so too was it proper to acknowledge those who had worked behind the scenes to make one's stay comfortable. The tokens themselves did not need to be valuable in the strictest sense. What mattered was the gesture, the sign that you had noticed the servant's labor and deemed it worthy of thanks. In great houses, the more affluent guests might leave coins sufficient to buy a new pair of shoes or a small bundle of firewood. Humbler visitors might give only a few copper pieces. Occasionally, gifts took more personal forms: a scrap of bright fabric, a little jar of ointment, a sprig of herbs. These items were prized not only for their utility but for what they conveyed, a message that the guests saw and respected the people who moved quietly through the halls. Over time, this custom became so ingrained that omitting it could feel almost like an insult. It suggested either forgetfulness or a deliberate disregard for those who occupied the lowest rungs of the household. And while a noble host might never voice disapproval aloud, the servants themselves often did. Stories of guests who departed empty-handed circulated among maids and porters, acquiring a tone of amused reproach. Even in smaller households, where the staff might consist only of a cook, a maid, and perhaps a stable hand, the ritual persisted. The tokens were smaller, the ceremony simpler, but the principle remained the same. A parting gift was a quiet exchange of respect, a signal that all parties understood their places and duties. If you picture yourself in such a moment, you can almost feel the hush of anticipation. Your hand reaches into a purse or pocket. You find the small coins you set aside. When you place them in the servant's hand, you might meet their eyes for the first time in days. There is often no word spoken, only the faint inclination of a head, a murmured acknowledgement, a brief meeting of understanding. And in that understated moment, you fulfill a bond older than you, older even than the manner itself. The practice of offering tokens persisted well into later centuries, gradually evolving as social conventions changed. In the Victorian era, such gifts became more formalized, sometimes tallied in ledgers with precise columns. But in earlier periods, the act remained closer to ritual, an organic, necessary gesture that completed the cycle of hospitality. And so, in the final hours of a visit, when the last trunk was lashed to the cart and the servants gathered to see you off, it was this small moment that lingered. A coin placed carefully, a modest gift pressed into a working hand, a brief silence that spoke of respect. In an age when reputation was woven from countless delicate threads, such parting tokens were never truly small. They were, in their quiet way, the final proof of your character. Even now, if you think back on that imagined journey, you can sense how these gentle exchanges shaped the unspoken language of courtesy. Though centuries have passed, and the great halls have grown still, the idea endures. that gratitude, when offered sincerely, leaves an impression that time cannot easily erase. The tradition of sharing family news and pledges of friendship. Imagine yourself arriving at the gates of a country manor in the early autumn of the 14th century. The road behind you is soft with fallen leaves, and the afternoon air carries a hint of wood smoke drifting from distant hearths. A servant appears to lead you across the worn flagstones, past low walls hung with drying herbs, and into the shaded interior of the hall. As your cloak is lifted from your shoulders, you are reminded of one unspoken expectation. You will be asked about your household. It was more than polite conversation. In medieval society, the sharing of family news was a tradition shaped by necessity and ambition alike. Families were rarely self-contained. They were part of a broad web of alliances, rivalries, and mutual dependencies. When you arrived as a guest, your stories, spoken in the hush of the hall or by the warmth of the fire, carried significance beyond their words. In the quieter hours after supper, when the servants cleared the trenchers and the candles were newly trimmed, hosts would invite guests to recount the health of their kin, the progress of marriages and births, or any notable happenings in their towns. Even small details, how a cousin had prospered in trade, whether a distant uncle had taken ill, helped the household situate itself in the shifting tapestry of local fortunes. These exchanges served a purpose. Imagine a lady of the house listening closely as you described the recent knighting of your brother or the purchase of new land. Each fact was gently noted, compared against her own family's circumstances, and weighed for its implications. Was your family rising in wealth? Had you formed new alliances? Did your successes or troubles suggest opportunity or risk? Yet this was never conducted as an interrogation. The tradition required a delicate balance. Curiosity tempered by courtesy, sincerity tinged with calculation. In the steady glow of candlelight, stories were told with a practiced modesty. A man might mention the enlargement of his flocks in the same tone as he recited a cousin's illness, as though to signal that fortune and hardship were threads woven together. There was also a certain pleasure in the ritual itself. The recounting of births, deaths, and betrothals connected one household to another across distances that could otherwise breed forgetfulness. In a world where news traveled slowly and letters were precious, these spoken updates were lifelines that preserved old friendships. A pledge of goodwill might be renewed simply by demonstrating that you remembered the names of your host's children, or that you carried tidings of a mutual acquaintance. Picture a fire crackling in the large stone hearth. Shadows climb the walls as you describe how your mother's garden had flourished or how the harvest had yielded fewer bushels than last year. You see the host's expression, sympathetic, perhaps tinged with relief, and understand that your news has been received as both a story and a signal. The telling is as much about reassurance as it is about information. Alongside the sharing of family news, it was customary to exchange pledges of friendship. These were not always grand declarations. More often, they emerged naturally from conversation. A promise to convey regards to a mutual friend, an offer of aid if illness or misfortune struck, a quiet assurance that bonds remained strong despite the miles between. Such pledges, spoken in low voices, carried a binding power. They reaffirmed that the relationship extended beyond the immediate visit and would persist through changing circumstances. In some regions, especially among wealthier families, it was common to seal these pledges with small tokens. A silver clasp passed discreetly from hand to hand. A length of fine cloth wrapped carefully in linen. Even a jar of preserved fruit could signify goodwill and shared prosperity. These gifts were not mere ornament. They were physical manifestations of loyalty, reminders that families watched over one another. Imagine the gentle ritual, your host pressing a small parcel into your palm, saying only, "For your table." In reply, you might offer a token of your own, perhaps a pouch of herbs from your garden or a carefully folded letter of introduction. The words exchanged in that moment carried a quiet gravity. They were neither boastful nor overly sentimental, simply acknowledgments that friendship required tending, like a fire that must be fed to remain bright. It was understood that to neglect these courtesies, to visit and offer no news, no pledge, was to risk a subtle estrangement. Silence, in such a setting, could be more telling than any unkind remark. A guest who spoke only in generalities might be judged secretive or dismissive, unwilling to share in the mutual obligations that knit households together. Over time, such reticence could breed suspicion, for it hinted at concealed ambitions or hidden misfortune. Yet this tradition had its gentler side as well. In many households, especially during the long winters when travel was rare, these shared stories became the season's brightest entertainment. Children sat quietly at their elders' feet, listening wide-eyed to tales of distant cousins and old feuds, of marriages arranged and postponed. The recounting of these details kept the absent present in memory and lent each gathering a sense of continuity with the past. And so, the rhythm of hospitality unfolded. Arrival, welcome, the setting aside of burdens, and finally the offering of news and pledges. Even when little else survived of a visit, when the gifts were forgotten and the meals unremarked, the memory of stories shared remained. It was this quiet custom that preserved alliances through war, famine, and the slow attrition of time. If you imagine yourself rising to leave the manor, the evening's talk behind you, you might feel the peculiar reassurance that comes from having fulfilled an ancient expectation. You have carried your household's fortunes to another hearth and received, in return, the stories that will travel back with you. And in that simple act, words spoken and remembered, you have reaffirmed a bond older than any single generation. In the hush of the departing footsteps, in the last soft words of farewell, there lingers the knowledge that the ties between families are not maintained by treaties alone. They are woven from the quiet pledges and the careful sharing of lives, an enduring pattern as familiar and necessary as the turning of the seasons themselves. The expectation that guests would not enter certain chambers. Imagine yourself as a guest in a noble English estate during the late 18th century. The carriage that brought you has long since disappeared down the drive, leaving you in the hush of the entrance hall. The air feels almost expectant, thick with the knowledge that you are now part of a world governed by countless quiet rules. Among these, one of the most unspoken and yet inviolable was the expectation that some chambers were never to be entered without explicit invitation. At first glance, the house might seem to unfold itself generously. A footman ushers you through the main reception rooms, high-ceilinged spaces draped in tapestries, bright with the flicker of polished mirrors and brass sconces. Here, you are free to admire the paintings and comment on the arrangement of fresh flowers. You are welcome to warm your hands by the hearth or to browse the volumes in the library alcove. All of it feels comfortably accessible. But beyond certain discreetly closed doors lay entire wings reserved for the family alone, spaces no guest, no matter how esteemed, was meant to cross. It was a delicate understanding, rarely spelled out. No steward would recite a list of forbidden thresholds, and no placard would declare a chamber private. Yet from the moment you entered, you were expected to sense the limits. A hallway ending in a closed door. A staircase veering into shadows rather than candlelight. An antechamber with no invitation to proceed further. These were all signs, quiet markers indicating that beyond lay rooms meant only for the intimate life of the household. Imagine walking the corridors after supper, perhaps in search of a place to admire the moonlit gardens. You pass an open archway, then another. A gentle curiosity tugs at you. What lies behind the far door, the one with the worn brass latch? But in this society, curiosity was never an excuse. To open that door, or even to rest your hand upon it, was to break a trust so profound that no apology could fully mend it. The house itself seemed to sense the difference between a guest who moved respectfully and one who forgot their place. The reasons behind this unwritten law were as much about dignity as about security. Private chambers were more than bedrooms. They were sanctuaries, places where the family could remove the careful masks they wore in public. Here, the lady of the house might sit with her hair unpinned, or a child might be comforted after a bad dream. The patriarch's study, often locked, could contain letters that shaped the fate of tenants and relations alike. A dressing room might hold jewelry whose value was measured not only in coin but in sentiment and memory. To enter such spaces without leave was to declare yourself unwilling to honor the line between host and intruder. This was true even in emergencies. There are quiet records, diaries and letters, describing occasions when a guest, hearing cries of alarm, would wait in an adjacent hall rather than burst unannounced into private rooms. The fear of presumption was stronger than any impulse to assist. Only when beckoned would a guest step across the threshold. And yet, the formality of these separations was not only a matter of caution. It was also a means of sustaining the delicate illusion that a household, no matter how wealthy, was governed by an orderly rhythm. Guests occupied their proper sphere, family theirs, and the smooth functioning of the estate depended on everyone remaining within invisible boundaries. Consider the experience of the servants. They were tasked with moving between these worlds, carrying trays from the kitchen into the drawing rooms, tending fires in both public and private spaces. Yet even they performed small rituals to indicate respect. A housemaid would knock softly before entering a dressing room. A valet would announce himself outside the master's study, waiting for acknowledgement before turning the handle. Guests were expected to observe these habits and to model their own conduct accordingly. Some homes made these boundaries clearer with architecture itself. You might see a gallery stretching from one end of the house to the other, a passage lined with portraits and curiosities. It was not uncommon for the family's wing to begin just beyond a discreet door at the gallery's end. In certain households, the family wing would be separated by a modest staircase or an arched entry curtained in heavy velvet. These were subtle but unmistakable signals. This space belongs to us alone. Imagine yourself standing at the threshold of such a passage, feeling the hush that gathers in places where no one expects to be observed. Perhaps a draft of cooler air drifts under the door. You feel the impulse to explore, to discover what the family wing conceals. But in the stillness of the hall, you remember the quiet consequence of such trespass. A single misstep could transform a gracious visit into a scandal whispered about for years afterward. Indeed, stories of these transgressions, rare though they were, became cautionary tales. A guest who strayed into private chambers, even by accident, might find their name omitted from future invitations. Their lapse would be repeated in drawing rooms miles away, cited as proof of bad breeding or an untrustworthy nature. A person who could not be trusted to respect the sanctity of a home might be presumed unreliable in other matters as well. And so, most visitors observed the boundaries with care. They lingered only where the household made space for them, where the hearth was lit and the chairs drawn close in welcome. When they returned to their own homes, they carried away a memory not only of hospitality but of the quiet discipline that underpinned it. The expectation that guests would not enter certain chambers was never about the fear of theft or the exposure of secrets alone. It was about maintaining a shared understanding, a silent compact that allowed families to preserve something private amid the demands of public life. In that way, the closed door at the end of the corridor was more than an obstacle. It was a symbol of the mutual respect upon which the entire edifice of noble society rested. Imagine, as you prepare to depart, that you pass once more along those corridors. You nod to the footman, who discreetly steps aside. You note the closed doors, familiar now, and feel no resentment toward their secrecy. You understand that some rooms are meant to remain beyond reach, that their quiet is essential to the life within. And as your carriage carries you away, you might reflect that the most important thresholds are often the ones you learn never to cross. The duty to observe household rituals without question or complaint. Imagine yourself arriving at a manor just after the hour of dusk. The lamps are being lit, one by one, each wick catching with a brief flare before settling into a steady glow. A servant leads you through a narrow passage, the walls hung with tapestries that soften the hush of your footfalls. You are tired from your journey, but already you sense that this household has its own rhythm, its own quiet rules that you will be expected to honor. Throughout much of Europe in centuries past, visiting another's home meant more than simply sharing a meal or a place by the fire. It meant accepting, without question or complaint, the intricate rituals that shaped the daily life of that household. Whether you were a fellow noble, a merchant with business to discuss, or a distant relative, the duty to observe these customs was an unspoken condition of your welcome. Imagine you are shown into the main hall. The table is already laid, its polished surface crowded with trenchers, cups, and small bowls of salt and herbs. Before anyone lifts a morsel to their lips, Your host stands and places a hand over the loaf of bread in the center. There is a moment of silence. You watch the other guests lower their heads. The fire crackles in the hearth. This simple act, a blessing of the bread, was practiced in countless variations. Sometimes the words were spoken aloud, in a language half remembered from older generations. Sometimes they were mouthed in silence, with only the bowed heads and still hands to signal the significance of the pause. Whether you shared the belief behind it or not, it was understood that you would take part without protest. The rhythm of these observances could feel foreign to an outsider. In some households, there were gestures to perform before taking your seat, a hand laid briefly upon the threshold stone, or a bow toward a small icon hung by the door. In others, there were customs so subtle that they could easily escape notice. A visitor might not realize that stepping into the hall without removing their shoes was a breach of etiquette until they felt the watchful gaze of the steward. To many, these rituals seemed merely decorative, yet they served a deeper purpose. They confirmed that a household was orderly, that its members and guests knew their place within it. They were, in essence, a soft assertion of identity. By submitting to them, you demonstrated respect, even humility. Imagine yourself in a chamber off the main hall. Here, the walls are hung with woven hangings that dampen every sound. The air smells of dried lavender. A servant gestures for you to sit on a low stool. You watch as others set aside their shoes and settle onto cushions. A bowl of water is passed from hand to hand so that each person may rinse their fingers before the evening meal. For some guests, these acts felt awkward, but the expectation was unwavering. You did not question, you did not comment. You simply mirrored the behavior around you. If you were uncertain, you waited, watched, and followed. Some of the rituals were born from religious practice. A moment of silence to honor the dead, a brief prayer spoken before retiring, or the quiet marking of a sign over a doorway. Others had practical origins, removing shoes to protect rush-covered floors, or cleansing hands before touching shared dishes. Over generations, such habits solidified into something approaching ceremony, each repetition reinforcing the household's claim to stability and refinement. Imagine, too, the smaller customs that unfolded throughout the evening. A certain seat reserved for the eldest member of the family, never to be taken by a guest. A pattern of passing the salt only after a nod from the host. The careful way in which the last cup of ale was offered, never poured directly but handed with both hands as a sign of respect. To a modern observer, these details might seem trivial, but in their time, they were considered essential. Failing to observe them could brand you as careless or arrogant. In some accounts, entire friendships cooled over such slights. A host who felt disrespected might never say so aloud, but the memory lingered, a quiet mark against your name. In many households, these expectations extended beyond meals. Imagine the evening drawing to a close. The candles have been snuffed one by one. A servant appears to guide you to your chamber. As you cross the threshold, you notice a sprig of herbs, rosemary or rue, tucked into the lintel. You do not ask why it is there. You do not question its purpose. Instead, you incline your head, acknowledging that here, in this place, small rituals mattered. Even the simple act of waking in the morning could carry its own expectations. In some regions, it was customary to greet the household not merely with a polite word but with a formal phrase invoking peace or blessing. The first time you spoke in the day, you signaled your understanding of the rules that held this small world together. Over time, these observances became a kind of quiet theater. Each guest learned to play their part, to absorb the gestures and silences without outward strain. It was not only about courtesy, it was about confirming the bonds that connected people to their hosts, to the land, and to each other. Imagine, as you prepare to depart, that you look back across the threshold. The rituals you observed, the blessing of the bread, the removal of shoes, the moment of silence, have left their impression, a memory of your willingness to belong, however briefly, to a life not your own. Even today, fragments of these old customs endure. You can see them when a visitor instinctively waits for the host to take the first bite, or when shoes are lined neatly by the door as a quiet sign of respect. They remind us that hospitality has always been more than food or shelter. It is a language of shared understanding, one in which observing the smallest ritual, without question or complaint, is the first and most necessary word. The custom of offering counsel when asked, never before. Imagine yourself seated in a high-backed chair near the hearth of a manor hall. The fire has burned low, and the last of the supper dishes have been cleared away, leaving the long table bare except for a few flickering candles. Around you, voices rise and fall in a gentle murmur, the evening's talk turning from the comfortable topics of weather and harvest to matters of more pressing importance. The management of the estate, the rights of tenants, the small conflicts that smolder between neighboring families. In such moments, it was not uncommon for a host to turn to a guest and request an opinion. This invitation, softly spoken, yet carrying great weight, was an honor and a test. To be asked for counsel was to be recognized as someone whose judgment deserved respect. It was an acknowledgement that your experience or wisdom might illuminate a difficulty or suggest a course of action. But only when asked. This was the delicate custom that threaded its way through noble households, merchant parlors, and even the humbler cottages of prosperous yeomen. You were never to volunteer advice unbidden. To do so would have been seen not merely as an error of manners, but as a declaration of arrogance, an insinuation that you believed yourself wiser, better informed, or more capable of governance than your host. Imagine the restraint this required. A guest might hear a matter discussed, a lease disputed, a steward's honesty questioned, a harvest plan debated, and feel certain they knew the proper answer. But unless the host turned to them with a clear request, they were to remain silent or confine themselves to the most neutral observations. There were, of course, times when the line blurred. A host might recount a problem in detail, glancing toward a guest as if to invite comment without quite saying so. The guest, in turn, might offer a cautious remark, phrased as a question rather than an instruction. Even then, they risked overstepping. A word too direct could be remembered for years. This custom had roots as practical as they were social. In a world where authority was intimately tied to reputation, no lord or lady wished to appear weak or indecisive. To receive unsolicited counsel in front of others could be an embarrassment, a suggestion that the master of the house could not manage their own affairs. Equally, a guest who presumed to advise without leave might be viewed as maneuvering for influence, seeking to bind the household's fortunes to their own advantage. Consider the rhythms of these conversations. When advice was genuinely desired, it was requested with care. A host might preface the question with a phrase such as, "If it please you, I would have your thoughts on this matter," or, "I wonder what counsel you might offer, for you have seen much in your travels." In that moment, the guest was granted permission to speak more freely, to offer opinion and suggestion without fear of seeming forward. Even then, the wisest guests framed their responses with deference. They might begin, "I am not certain, but it seems to me," or, "If I may be so bold, perhaps you might consider." This language softened the impact of their words, ensuring that the host retained the dignity of final judgment. In larger households, where multiple visitors gathered around the hearth or table, the custom could become a silent contest of perception. One guest might be called upon to advise while another, equally ambitious, waited in vain for their own invitation. The uninvited would sometimes attempt to signal their expertise through subtle interjections or knowing expressions, hoping to draw the host's attention. But the more circumspect recognized that patience and discretion often carried greater rewards than eagerness. In the records that survive, household accounts, letters, the memoirs of stewards, we find glimpses of this etiquette in action. A visitor praised for offering counsel only at the Lord's pleasure. Another, gently rebuked for speaking in matters where he was neither entreated nor desired. These small judgments could shape reputations that lasted far beyond the visit itself. Imagine the quiet strain this imposed. A guest might sit for hours, hearing details of a dispute they knew how to settle, watching as the household weighed options imperfectly. The desire to help might press heavily against the barrier of custom. And yet to cross it without leave was to risk offending the very person whose favor mattered most. Over time, such restraint became part of the rhythm of social life. It taught patience, humility, and the art of listening. It reminded all who gathered in those candlelit halls that wisdom, however valuable, must be offered with care and received with grace. Even beyond matters of estate management, the same principles applied to other spheres. In questions of marriage negotiations, inheritance, or alliances, a guest's silence could be as significant as any word they spoke. The most respected advisors understood that counsel was most powerful when it was both requested and thoughtfully given, shaped to the needs and temperament of the listener. When you picture these gatherings, men and women in heavy wool or fine brocade, seated among carved chairs and faded banners, consider the tension just beneath the surface. Every conversation was a dance of courtesy and strategy, every opinion weighed before it left the tongue. The flicker of firelight on anxious faces, the soft clink of a cup being set down, the careful phrasing of each sentence, all were part of a ritual that governed not only the business of the estate, but the fragile web of respect on which a household's peace depended. So the next time you think of a medieval hall, imagine the quiet discipline of those who waited to be asked. It was not only what they knew that mattered, but when, and whether, they chose to speak. And in that patience lay a subtle power, the knowledge that true counsel, offered only when invited, could shape the fortunes of a house for generations. The ritual of walking the grounds with the host each morning. Imagine yourself waking before dawn in a large country manor. The first light is seeping through the edges of heavy drapes, turning the chamber a muted gray. In the hallways beyond your door, there is already movement. The faint creak of floorboards as servants carry hot water for washing, the distant hush of voices exchanging morning instructions. Soon, you will be expected to dress and join your host for a ritual that may seem simple, but held a quiet gravity in households across England and much of Europe, the morning walk of the estate. This daily practice was not merely a polite outing. It was an established custom by which a host demonstrated mastery of the land and a guest demonstrated respect for that stewardship. In an age when land was the most tangible measure of power, the opportunity to showcase fields, gardens, woodlets, and pastures was both a point of pride and a subtle reminder of a family's standing. If you picture yourself descending the main staircase, the air is cool and still tinged with the scent of yesterday's fires. A footman nods as you pass, perhaps offering a polite murmur that your host awaits you in the courtyard. There, you might find the gentleman already cloaked against the chill, a walking stick in hand. A few hounds stir at his feet, watching with mild curiosity as you approach. To remain indoors during this hour, to linger over bread and ale by the hearth, was quietly interpreted as a slight. It suggested either frailty or indifference to the estate's beauty and prosperity. Even those unaccustomed to early rising learned that courtesy demanded participation. Hosts were not usually offended by a guest's ignorance of field rotation or orchard yields, but they expected at least the semblance of interest. The walk itself unfolded in a measured progression. The host would lead along a worn path that wound past the gardens, where neat rows of herbs still glistened with dew. He might pause to comment on the resilience of certain plants after the late frost, or to note how the bees had taken to the new hives. Each observation was an invitation, an opening for the guest to admire, inquire, or simply acknowledge the household's attentive care. As you walked together, the rhythm of boots over gravel and packed earth became a kind of conversation in itself. You might feel the cool edge of the morning air on your face, hear the quiet splashing of a fountain in the distance, smell the sweetness of damp grass mingled with the sharper scent of stables. These impressions were part of the experience, a sensory proof that you had seen the land as it was. Sometimes, the path extended beyond the formal gardens into wilder spaces, a small copse of trees, a stretch of meadow where cattle grazed. Here, the host's role shifted slightly, from steward to a sort of guide, pointing out markers of the property's long history. A mound that once formed part of an ancient boundary, a stand of oaks planted generations before, a stream diverted by the efforts of past tenants. In each detail lay the quiet assertion of continuity, the idea that a family's care shaped not only houses but landscapes themselves. Guests were expected to respond with appreciation, if not genuine curiosity. A thoughtful remark about the symmetry of an orchard, or the health of the livestock, was enough to signal respect. Silence was permissible, provided it was attentive rather than indifferent. But to rush the walk, to glance repeatedly toward the house, or to express a wish to return indoors too soon, these were small discourtesies that a host would remember. Records from the period sometimes mention such lapses. A visitor who excused himself with vague complaints of fatigue, or who neglected to offer any word of praise, might be noted in a household ledger with a tactful phrase such as, "less disposed to early habit." This was a polite way of marking a deficiency of manners, the sort of detail that could be quietly shared among neighboring families. For many hosts, the walk also had a practical purpose. It was a chance to inspect the grounds, to see firsthand what reports and ledgers could not convey. A fence in need of mending, a patch of earth gone fallow, a corner of the garden overtaken by weeds, these small observations informed the day's instructions to the steward or gardener. In this way, the morning walk maintained a connection between the family's authority and the land's daily reality. Imagine yourself now nearing the end of the circuit, the house rising once more into view with its chimneys sending up pale wisps of smoke. You feel the faint warmth returning to your hands, the stiffness easing from your limbs. A servant waits near the steps, ready to receive the walking sticks and usher you back indoors, where breakfast will be set out in quiet readiness. The host might pause for a final moment, surveying the land with a satisfied nod before turning to you. A courteous word, thanking you for your company on this small tour, serves as a signal that the ritual has been fulfilled. Whatever business or leisure follows, you have completed the morning's essential act of respect. Over time, as travel became more common and households less anchored to agricultural life, the tradition softened. Guests in later centuries could sometimes forego the walk without causing offense, especially in urban settings where land was less central to identity. But in the great houses of earlier eras, when power was measured in acres and tenants, the morning walk remained a vital part of hospitality's unspoken language. And so, if you ever find yourself imagining a stay in such a place, remember this: the early hour, the cool breath of dawn, the host's quiet pride in every path and planting. In that gentle ritual lay a world of meaning, respect offered and returned, courtesy expressed not through grand declarations but by the simple act of walking side by side, seeing the land as it was, and acknowledging the care that shaped it. The subtle rivalries played out in gifts exchanged over supper. Imagine yourself stepping into the warm, flickering light of a great hall as evening descends beyond the narrow windows. The air is fragrant with roasted meats and herbs. Long tables have been arranged in neat ranks, each place carefully set with polished trenchers and pewter cups. A hush settles over the assembly as the guests begin to arrive in small groups, cloaks dusted with the last chill of twilight. It was here, beneath carved beams and candlelit rafters, that one of the quietest contests unfolded, a rivalry measured not in words but in the gifts exchanged over supper. In many medieval households, gift-giving was woven seamlessly into the rituals of hospitality. A guest was expected to bring some token of respect, perhaps a flask of rare wine, a length of fine wool, or a small box of preserved fruit. But in wealthier circles, where status was as carefully tended as a garden, these offerings became more than gestures of courtesy. They were subtle declarations of influence and ambition. Imagine the first guest stepping forward. He bows to the host and produces a modest parcel wrapped in cloth, a little honeycomb from his estate's hives. It is received with a gracious nod, the sort of gift that signals familiarity rather than ostentation. Moments later, a second guest approaches, her servants bearing a lacquered chest inlaid with brass. Inside, carefully packed, are candied lemons imported from a distant port. The assembled company draws in a quiet breath. A gift of such rarity is not offered lightly. In that moment, the unspoken contest has begun. Each gift, placed discreetly at the host's right hand, is both a symbol of esteem and a declaration of means. While no one would be so vulgar as to boast outright, every eye observes the procession. The steward notes each item with care, and the guests along the benches measure the gifts against their own. This rivalry rarely erupted into open conflict. Instead, it unfolded in glances and soft remarks, in the careful way a host might lift one offering before another, praising the craftsmanship or remarking on the effort required to procure it. To bring something too grand risked being seen as arrogant. To arrive with too modest a token invited pity or mild disdain. The art lay in striking the perfect balance, generous but not ostentatious, thoughtful but not commonplace. Picture the tables filling with guests. The hall brightens as more candles are lit, their glow catching on polished goblets and the rich embroidery of sleeves. Servants circulate with trenchers piled high, and the clink of knives on platters mingles with low conversation. Amid this gentle tumult, the gifts rest in a place of quiet prominence, a reminder to all that esteem was never static. Some guests use this custom to announce new fortunes. A man who had recently acquired land might present a small silver cup engraved with his family's crest, a sign that his standing had grown. Another, eager to cement alliances, might offer a bolt of rare silk with a promise that more would follow in the months ahead. These gestures were not merely transactions but invitations, an unspoken request to be regarded with renewed respect. Imagine yourself seated midway down the table, watching as each parcel is unwrapped and remarked upon. You notice the faint lift of an eyebrow as the steward reveals a gilt-edged prayer book, the slight tightening of a jaw when a rival's gift draws murmurs of admiration. Even as laughter and polite conversation fill the hall, these tiny signs betray the currents running beneath the surface. Hosts, too, played their part with careful diplomacy. A gracious word, a lingering touch on a box lid, a promise to display the gift prominently, all conveyed approval. Yet a host might also respond with subtle reserve, offering thanks in a measured tone if the gift seemed a calculated attempt to overawe. Such restraint was a quiet reminder that esteem, once given, could just as easily be withheld. As the meal progressed, courses arriving in measured intervals of fish, fowl, and sweetmeats, the gifts remained within sight, their presence shaping the evening's mood. No list was read aloud. No scores were tallied. Yet everyone understood that these offerings would be remembered long after the last cup was drained. And when the supper finally ended, and the guests began to depart into the darkness beyond the torches, the host would linger over the gifts once more. Servants gathered them carefully, each item recorded and placed in secure storage. In the days that followed, letters of thanks might be penned, with phrases chosen to convey just enough warmth to satisfy the giver, but never so much as to concede advantage. Imagine the host seated alone in the hall after the guests had gone. The long tables stand empty, their surfaces reflecting the dying candlelight. Before him, the array of gifts is spread, tokens of friendship, perhaps, but also quiet challenges. For in this world, where alliances were constantly shifting, even the simplest parcel of preserved fruit or a piece of painted pottery spoke volumes. To understand this tradition is to glimpse how medieval society measured worth. It was not only in wealth but in the readiness to display generosity without appearing grasping. The art of the supper gift lay in offering a glimpse of abundance, enough to inspire admiration, never so much as to provoke resentment. And so, each supper became a careful choreography of esteem. A guest's standing was tested not with declarations, but with small, potent gestures. And all who shared the table watched with practiced eyes, weighing each offering, noting each reaction, and carrying those impressions back into the wider world beyond the manor gates. In the end, it was a contest no one acknowledged outright, yet no one ever truly escaped. The rivalry in gifts was like a thread woven through the fabric of every gathering, a quiet reminder that in medieval life, honor and ambition were never far apart, and every gesture was both a courtesy and a calculation. The obligation to respect household taboos and superstitions. Imagine yourself stepping through a carved doorway into a great hall dimly lit by beeswax candles. The air feels thick with the mingled smells of smoke and dried herbs, and somewhere, behind a heavy tapestry, a draft stirs the flame. You pause just inside, waiting for the steward to announce your name, your hands lightly clasped. From this first moment, you sense there are rules here, some spoken, others only implied. Throughout much of the medieval and early modern world, every household possessed its own private collection of taboos and superstitions. These were not always written down or openly declared. Often, they hovered like a quiet mist over daily life, an understanding that certain things were simply never done, certain words never spoken, certain objects never touched. As a guest, Your success depended less on what you knew in advance than on how well you could observe, absorb, and adapt. Imagine you are escorted to your seat at the table. Before you, a polished board holds the evening's fare: dark bread, a wedge of sharp cheese, a dish of dried cherries steeped in wine. You reach for the salt, only to see your host's hand lift in a small, subtle gesture of restraint. In this household, perhaps, it is considered ill-omened to pass salt directly hand to hand. The proper course is to set the dish down upon the table, allowing the other person to pick it up themselves. No one would scold you openly for the mistake, but a hush might settle around the board, the talk resuming only when the rhythm of custom was restored. Such taboos often arose from half-remembered stories, incidents buried generations deep in family lore. Perhaps an ancestor had died unexpectedly after receiving a gift of iron nails, and so no metal trinkets were ever brought into the house again. Or a particular flower, perfectly innocent in other homes, was believed to carry bad luck here. These beliefs might seem peculiar to an outsider, but within the household, they were part of the invisible fabric that held life together. Imagine a small side chamber where you have been invited to rest before supper. On the mantel sits a delicate carved figurine, its features worn smooth with age. Perhaps it depicts a saint or some local spirit of protection. In some houses, guests were expected to acknowledge such icons with a brief nod or a murmured phrase of respect. In others, touching or even remarking upon them was forbidden. One learned to move carefully, to watch for the slight shifts in expression or posture that signaled an unseen boundary. These taboos could extend to everyday gestures. In certain noble families, it was considered ill-fated to enter a room with the left foot first. In others, whistling indoors was believed to summon misfortune. A guest who failed to observe such prohibitions risked not only personal embarrassment but also the sense that they had disturbed the delicate order of the house. The obligations did not end with what you did. They included what you said. Some households avoided naming particular animals aloud, wolves especially, believing that speaking the word might draw them nearer. Others forbade any mention of illness at the table. Even a passing remark about an ache or chill could be met with a quick, uneasy glance, as though the words themselves carried contagion. Imagine, too, that certain days were marked by special caution. The eve of a saint's feast, or the anniversary of some ancestral tragedy, might be observed with small, deliberate absences. No singing, no laughter, no toasts raised. A guest who failed to notice the hush could unintentionally break the unspoken pact of remembrance. The most successful visitors were those who understood that hospitality required not only gratitude but also sensitivity. To remain alert to these hidden expectations was to show respect, not just for the family but for all the generations that had shaped its private world. Even the simplest acts could become a form of tribute. You might notice how the bread was broken a certain way, or how the hearth was tended with 3 careful strokes of the poker. You learned to mirror these patterns, not because you shared the belief behind them, but because you recognized their importance to your hosts. Imagine the end of an evening spent in quiet observance. The fire has burned low, and a servant moves through the hall, drawing shutters closed against the night. You rise, incline your head, and retreat to the guest chamber prepared for you. As you pass beneath a garland of dried herbs hung in the doorway, you do not ask what it means. You do not question why it must remain there, or what might happen if it were disturbed. Instead, you accept that here, in this place, your role is not to judge but to honor. To some, such customs might appear burdensome, even stifling. But they also offered a kind of reassurance, a structure to daily life, a sense that the world was not merely chaotic but shaped by countless small acts of reverence and caution. Over centuries, many of these household taboos slowly faded. New generations questioned the old prohibitions, or simply forgot them. Yet fragments survive even today. In the small rituals we continue without thinking. A hesitation before stepping over a threshold. A pause before offering condolences. A feeling that some places or some objects are better left unspoken. As you imagine yourself preparing to depart the manor at dawn, you carry with you not only the memory of food and shelter but also the awareness that you have walked a path bordered by unseen markers. In respecting them, you demonstrated that you understood the deeper nature of hospitality, that to be welcomed is also to be entrusted with the weight of another's beliefs. And so you step out into the chill morning air, the door closing behind you with a quiet finality. The household returns to its own rhythm, the rituals you observed continuing in your absence. And you, for all your brief presence, have become part of its long, unbroken story, a guest who learned to honor what could not be seen. The expectation of restraint in storytelling and humor. Imagine yourself seated in a long dining hall, the sort that seems almost designed to quiet the spirit. Candles flicker along the high sideboards, their flames mirrored in the dark polish of oak paneling. You are surrounded by the gentle clink of silver cutlery and the occasional low murmur of conversation drifting between courses. In such a setting, every word carries a weight it might not possess elsewhere. It is here that the expectation of restraint in storytelling and humor quietly rules the gathering. In noble households of the 17th and 18th centuries, dinner was more than a meal. It was a ceremonial affirmation of rank, of education, of refinement. Each guest took their place according to a careful calculus of status and kinship. Just as one's attire was chosen to reflect respect for the host, so too was one's conduct, especially the stories one shared and the laughter they provoked, measured and moderated to avoid the slightest suggestion of excess. Imagine, for a moment, that you have been invited to share an anecdote. The company leans in, attentive but composed. You must select your tale with care. A story too somber risks dampening the spirit of the meal. A jest too broad or too indelicate can mark you as someone unable to discern the subtle boundaries of polite society. Even the tone of your delivery matters. Loud, boisterous laughter was generally frowned upon, regarded as a sign of rustic origins or, worse, a lack of self-command. One can picture how a skilled storyteller navigated these invisible lines. The narrative might begin with a gentle recollection of travel or a brief description of an encounter at court. It would unfurl in a tone that invited amusement without demanding it. If laughter came, it was a measured ripple, smiles exchanged discreetly rather than eruptions of mirth that might eclipse the host's own presence. For to outshine your host, whether in wit, in spirit, or in spectacle, was a quiet form of discourtesy. The expectation of restraint extended beyond the content of stories to the nature of humor itself. In many households, particularly among the higher ranks, there was a suspicion of humor that relied upon vulgarity or ridicule. Coarse tales were thought to reveal something undisciplined about the teller. They hinted at an inability to distinguish between what was appropriate in a village alehouse and what belonged at a nobleman's table. Guests who indulged in such humor, even once, risked being remembered less for their presence than for their misjudgment. Imagine the discomfort of a host obliged to redirect the conversation after an ill-considered jest. Perhaps a heavy pause would descend, broken only by the polite cough of a servant refilling glasses. In these moments, the company might exchange glances that said more than words. It was an experience few would willingly repeat. Yet, it would be a mistake to think that these gatherings were devoid of genuine warmth or gentle amusement. There was, within the bounds of restraint, room for shared enjoyment. A well-turned phrase, a clever observation, or a recollection of some small domestic absurdity could draw appreciative smiles. It was the manner of telling, the balance of levity with composure, that mattered most. Even in laughter, a guest was expected to remain conscious of their surroundings and the delicate currents of deference that shaped every interaction. Consider how even gestures were moderated. When a particularly amusing remark was offered, the appropriate response was not to slap the table or to throw back one's head in abandon. Instead, one might incline slightly toward the speaker, perhaps allowing a soft chuckle to escape. A hand raised lightly to the lips could signal appreciation without undermining the dignity of the moment. These were small, habitual cues that ensured the conviviality of the gathering never spilled into chaos. This discipline of restraint served a larger purpose. It upheld the household's claim to refinement and civility. In a culture where the boundary between the genteel and the common was vigilantly maintained, decorous speech was another marker of belonging. Just as the quality of the linen or the polish on the silver revealed something about the family's fortunes, so too did the conduct of their guests reflect upon them. Imagine, too, the pressure this placed upon visitors. Especially those newly arrived from more provincial backgrounds often studied their hosts with quiet intensity, gauging the acceptable degree of familiarity and humor. In letters and diaries, you find traces of this careful observation, guests describing with relief how they had avoided giving offense or recounting in mortification the moment they realized they had overstepped. It was not uncommon for newcomers to practice polite anecdotes in advance. A story rehearsed by candlelight in one's chamber the night before might be delivered with precise moderation at dinner. Even then, a guest often watched the host's face closely for the smallest sign of approval or caution. In this way, the art of storytelling became both a social skill and a quiet test of character. Over time, the expectations of restraint and composure became so ingrained that they rarely needed explicit reinforcement. A guest who understood the codes was welcomed again. One who failed to do so might find the next invitation slow to arrive. Such consequences were never discussed directly, but everyone understood their meaning. As you picture the last of the dishes being cleared away, the candles guttering lower in their holders, you can almost feel the gentle fatigue that settles over a company which has spent hours maintaining these delicate balances. The laughter has been soft, the stories measured, the warmth of the evening contained within its proper bounds. And in that restraint, there is a kind of peace, a mutual understanding that no one has overstepped, that all have preserved the dignity of the occasion. Imagine yourself rising from the table, offering a word of thanks for the hospitality. You feel a quiet satisfaction in knowing you have met the expectations, neither too dull nor too forward, neither silent nor unguarded. As you make your way back to your chamber, you might reflect that the calm of such an evening lies not in the absence of humor but in the discipline that shapes it. And so it was in these households, generation after generation. Boisterous laughter and coarse tales were left beyond the threshold, where they belonged. Within, there remained a gentler form of amusement, one that balanced spirit with composure, always careful never to eclipse the host or disturb the polished surface of noble life. The quiet competition over dress and presentation each day. Imagine yourself waking in a narrow bedchamber, the dawn light creeping in across a polished floor strewn with rushes. A thin veil of mist still clings to the window panes. Somewhere in the hush beyond the door, servants are already stirring, laying fires, warming water, fetching garments carefully folded the night before. This is not simply the start of another day. It is the beginning of a small, unspoken contest, one measured not by proclamations or boasts but by the quiet, constant negotiation of dress and presentation. In a great house or manor, every dawn brought with it the same question: what shall you wear, and what shall it say about you? In an age when reputation was as valuable as land or coin, clothing was never simply practical. It was a declaration, a means of signaling respect for your host, consideration for the occasion, and awareness of your place within the shifting ranks of guests. To underdress, arriving in garments too plain or hastily arranged, suggested carelessness or even hidden scorn. Yet to overdress, appearing in fabrics too sumptuous or jewels too bold, risked another offense, that of vanity or of attempting to outshine one's host. Imagine the hush of the chambers where guests readied themselves. Valises unbuckled, layers of linen and wool laid out in neat succession. A woman's maid or a gentleman's valet inspecting each seam, ensuring no crease remained to hint at neglect. A traveling wardrobe might contain garments for every conceivable moment. Morning audiences, afternoon walks, hunting expeditions, evening suppers. Each change was a fresh opportunity to convey the right balance of dignity and deference. There was, too, an element of strategy. One might dress more plainly upon arrival, allowing space to impress later in the visit. The first supper might call for moderate finery, just enough embroidery at the collar, a modest chain of office. Then, on the evening when the household's most important guests assembled, the finer garments would emerge. Brocades woven with metallic thread, gowns edged in fur, doublets of deeper, richer colors that caught the light of countless candles. But even as you prepared, you could never be entirely sure how your choices would be received. There were no printed guides, no lists of expectations. Instead, you learned through observation. A glance at the host's attire could offer clues. Was their own dress modest, suggesting a more restrained occasion? Or did their household display a quiet opulence that demanded acknowledgement in your own appearance? Among guests themselves, clothing created a field of subtle rivalry. To appear too eager to impress was unwise. To appear indifferent was equally perilous. Conversation over the morning meal often included a careful study of each person's sleeve, clasp, and hem. Compliments were exchanged in cautious tones, sometimes sincere, sometimes edged with the gentlest irony. For many, preparing garments in advance was as essential as planning the visit itself. Before departing home, inventories were checked and rechecked. Embroiderers were engaged to refresh old finery. New shoes were ordered to match particular ensembles. Even traveling cloaks were selected with care, for the first glimpse a host had of their arriving guest might set the tone for the entire stay. This quiet competition extended to personal grooming. Hair was dressed in styles appropriate to the hour and the company. Beards were trimmed to a length neither ostentatious nor unkempt. The scent of clean linen and the faint trace of perfumed water were themselves considered small declarations of refinement. To be known as one who neglected such details was to risk being spoken of in hushed voices after the evening's end. Imagine the pressure of maintaining this delicate balance day after day. A guest might rise each morning wondering whether yesterday's attire had been well judged. Did the host's approving nod mean success, or was it merely courtesy? Did other guests notice the mended cuff, the slightly dated cut of a doublet, the too ornate clasp at a lady's throat? Even more challenging was the fact that the rules could change with little warning. A sudden hunting party might demand simpler garments, sturdy boots, and a readiness to ride. A feast to honor an unexpected visitor might require the swift retrieval of finer dress from a chest still unopened. Guests learned to be prepared for all possibilities, for each shift in the household's rhythm brought with it new expectations. Yet in this constant assessment lay a certain comfort. Everyone shared the same uncertainty, the same quiet hope that their choices would strike the right chord. The awareness of mutual scrutiny created a sense of fellowship, an unspoken recognition that all were engaged in the same careful dance. When evening fell and the household gathered once more in the hall, the results of each day's preparations became part of the scene itself. The gleam of polished clasps, the muted shimmer of carefully chosen silk, the modest dignity of simpler homespun, worn with evident pride. All these details wove together to form the visual language of respect and ambition, humility and self-regard. As you imagine yourself in that world, consider how much thought lay behind every ribbon, every fold of fabric. Each choice was weighed not only for its beauty but for the story it told about its wearer, their attentiveness, their judgment, their sense of belonging. In a society where the spoken word might be cautious and the written word slow to travel, a person's appearance often spoke first, and most eloquently. So the next time you picture a medieval or early modern gathering, guests seated beneath high beams, candlelight dancing across carved paneling, imagine too the quiet competition that began with the first light of day. A contest without overt winners, where triumph lay in a glance of approval, a soft word of praise, or simply in the knowledge that you had neither presumed too much nor offered too little. In that careful balance, a guest could find both reassurance and the subtle pleasure of knowing their place, and their presence, had been exactly right. The custom of listening patiently to long genealogical recitations, imagine yourself seated in the great hall of a country house, the candlelight moving gently along carved beams overhead. The hour is late enough that the warmth of the day has faded, and a faint draft creeps along the flagstones. You are comfortable enough in a high-backed chair, a goblet in your hand, but you are aware that you have entered the final ritual of the evening, the recitation of the host's lineage. It was a custom with roots reaching deep into the medieval period and beyond. In an age when family was the principal claim to status, recounting one's ancestry was both a form of self-definition and a declaration of legitimacy. To know precisely who one's forebears had been, and to repeat their names with care, was a sign of cultivation and rank. Picture the host, perhaps a dignified figure in late middle age, seated at the head of the table or near the fire. His voice is steady, with the mild formality of a man who has rehearsed this recitation many times. The The rhythm is unhurried, each generation announced as though it were a precious link in a long, unbroken chain. You might hear names that sound familiar: local landowners, minor nobility whose descendants still live in neighboring counties. Others drift past you with no clear shape, names pulled from centuries of marriages and inheritances. Some carried faint legends: an ancestor who fought at Agincourt, another who was granted a crest by a long-dead monarch. The stories attached to these names could be as brief as a single phrase: "He was known for his steadfastness," or as elaborate as a small saga. For the guest, the role was defined by patience. It was understood that you would sit quietly, your expression composed. A nod at the mention of a known family was appropriate. A small exclamation of appreciation, "Ah, indeed," might be offered when the host described some notable forebear. But under no circumstance was it acceptable to look away with a glazed expression or to let your attention obviously drift. In this subtle performance of hospitality, feigned interest was part of one's duty. The lineage recitation was not merely for the host's satisfaction. It was a reaffirmation of shared social bonds. By listening, you signaled your recognition of the family's standing, your respect for the generations that had shaped this house and the land around it. Imagine the fire popping softly in the hearth as the litany continues. The candle flames lean in a small current of air. You catch yourself tracing the pattern of the tables with grain, only to bring your gaze swiftly back to the speaker's face. There is a rhythm to this ceremony: the host's measured voice, the occasional clearing of the throat, the polite sounds of assent from the other guests. Servants might pass through with more wine or with little dishes of spiced nuts, moving with silent efficiency so as not to interrupt. A few guests, better acquainted with the family, might ask gentle questions: "And was Sir Thomas your great-grandfather or your great-uncle?" which allowed the host to clarify and expand. This was welcomed, provided the inquiry was phrased with tact and genuine seeming interest. The length of these recitations varied. Some hosts confined themselves to a few generations, the most distinguished ancestors, and the essential marriages that secured titles or property. Others ranged further back, unspooling names from centuries before. In some households, it was considered a mark of dignity to trace the line all the way to the Norman conquest, or to legendary figures whose existence was, at best, uncertain. One might think such performances would be tiresome, and indeed, in private diaries, guests sometimes admitted to a sense of quiet fatigue. But they also understood the necessity. In a world without reliable public records or modern credentials, memory and narrative were all that preserved claims to land, rank, and identity. To refuse to listen would be to dismiss not just the host's pride but the very foundation of the household's place in society. The etiquette surrounding these recitations was precise. You were expected to appear engaged, even if you could not possibly retain all the names. To interrupt with your own family history would be considered presumptuous. To attempt to shorten the process with a hasty compliment, "How remarkable! You must be very proud," was a transparent breach of courtesy. Only when the host reached the final generation, often ending with himself and his heirs, was it suitable to offer warm appreciation and perhaps a toast to the family's continued prosperity. If you picture yourself there, you can almost feel the particular blend of formality and intimacy. The recitation was a kind of threshold. A visitor who endured it graciously was marked as a person of good breeding. Those who could manage an intelligent question or a sympathetic comment were remembered favorably. And those who betrayed boredom, however briefly, risked a subtle estrangement. When at last the final ancestor's name was spoken, there would be a gentle exhalation in the room. The host might smile, folding his hands as though laying down a burden. The candles would sputter a little lower. The company, released from the spell of so many generations, might begin to talk of more immediate concerns: politics, harvests, the weather in town. In later centuries, as printed genealogies became more common, some families committed their lineages to parchment and bound volumes. These might be ceremonially shown rather than recited aloud. But even then, the ritual retained its quiet power. The names on the page were more than historical details. They were evidence of belonging. And so, if you ever imagine yourself seated by the hearth in such a house, remember that patient listening was more than good manners. It was an offering of respect, an acknowledgement that a household was not built in a single lifetime, but assembled name by name, story by story, across the slow passage of time. The ritual farewell conducted at the threshold by the entire household. Imagine yourself standing at the threshold of a medieval manor in the early morning light. The air is brisk, carrying the scent of dew on the grass and faint wood smoke from kitchen fires already kindled. Your visit has drawn to a close, and now comes the moment that, in many ways, will define the memory you leave behind. For in this world, departure was not a casual matter. The farewell itself was a small ceremony, observed with care by every member of the household. From the highest-ranking lord to the youngest servant, each had a place in the ritual leave-taking. To neglect this custom, or to conduct it carelessly, risked a subtle wound to the relationship that might linger long after you had ridden out of sight. Imagine the host and his family assembling in the doorway. The lady of the house stands with her hands folded, her expression composed but attentive. The steward waits nearby, ready to record any last pledges or messages. Even the household's children, their hair neatly combed for the occasion, gather at the edge of the step. This scene is not merely courtesy, it is the culmination of everything your visit has signified: fellowship, obligation, the delicate balance of respect between guest and host. In many households, the farewell began with the presentation of small tokens. A guest might offer a modest parcel, spices wrapped in cloth, or a letter of thanks, to be accepted by the lady of the house. The host, in turn, might direct a servant to place a parting gift in your baggage: a flask of sweet wine, a folded length of wool, or a little loaf of bread to sustain you on your journey. Each gesture was as deliberate as the exchange of gifts upon arrival, meant to demonstrate mutual regard and to mark the conclusion of shared time. Picture the moment when you step forward to offer your final words. Your host meets your gaze steadily, and for a few quiet breaths, there is no movement in the doorway. The hush that descends then is no accident. It is the space in which both parties acknowledge that something of consequence has passed between them: friendship renewed, alliances confirmed, or perhaps only a simple kindness extended. The words spoken in that pause were carefully chosen. A guest might express gratitude for hospitality, remarking on the warmth of the welcome or the excellence of the fare. A promise to return, if sincerely given, was received as a compliment of the highest order. Even a simple blessing, "May God keep this house in peace," had a weight that would be remembered. Hosts listened closely, noting the sincerity and tone, storing away impressions to be recalled later in conversation or correspondence. This formality extended beyond the principal figures. The entire household was expected to demonstrate respect. As you stepped across the threshold, servants and younger members of the family would bow or curtsy. A nod from the steward, a quiet, safe journey, or a child's shy farewell all contributed to the impression of a household united in courtesy. Imagine the procession that followed, your host walking beside you to the outer gate, perhaps resting a hand lightly on your arm in a final gesture of goodwill. Along the path, other members of the household paused in their morning labors to incline their heads. Each acknowledgement was part of the same ritual, an unbroken thread of respect that stretched from the private rooms of the manor to the farthest edge of its lands. The threshold itself held symbolic significance. To cross it at the start of a visit was to enter into a bond of hospitality. To cross it again at the end, in the company of your hosts, was to conclude that bond with dignity. In some households, a final prayer was offered here, murmured in Latin by the head of the family, invoking protection over the journey ahead. This practice served not only as a blessing but as a gentle reminder that all comings and goings lay under divine providence. Even in more modest dwellings, the farewell carried this same gravity. A yeoman's family, though without a great hall or retinue of servants, would nonetheless gather at the doorway to express gratitude and to receive it in return. The courtesy extended to all guests, whether they were noble cousins or traveling clerics. In an age when distance often meant prolonged separation, the ritual farewell was a way to imprint the visit in memory, to reassure both guest and host that they remained bound by shared respect. After the final words were spoken, your host would step back, allowing you to cross the threshold fully. Only then did the formality ease. You might turn in the saddle to lift a hand in parting, or glance back to see the household still assembled in the doorway. This last sight, a family gathered, faces turned toward you, was a reminder that every visit left an imprint, and that even departure was an event to be measured and remembered. Long after you had disappeared down the road, the farewell would be recounted. A host might remark to his wife, "He spoke graciously," or perhaps, with a note of regret, "He seemed in haste." Such recollections shaped reputation. A guest known for warmth and courtesy at parting was more likely to be welcomed again, while one who slipped away without formality might find future invitations slow to arrive. If you imagine yourself looking back once more before the turning of the lane hides the house from view, you will feel the peculiar weight of that final exchange. The quiet ceremony, the careful words, the poised faces all signal that you have been seen and acknowledged. In a world where reputation was as much a currency as coin, these small rituals were not mere ornament. They were essential. And so, the farewell at the threshold was more than a polite custom. It was a final testament to the nature of the relationship, a mirror in which both guest and host glimpsed themselves. A moment of formality, perhaps, but also of genuine connection, carrying, in the measured voices and the stillness of the doorway, the assurance that the bond between households would endure beyond the parting of their paths.